Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 16th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific to understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I am grateful that you are here. Okay, I promise today we will conclude this multi-part episode about Alexander the Great. No, really. We've been here for a while, but some of the most interesting events are yet to come. Last time, we followed Alexander as he all but wrapped up his conquest of Persia, beating, then burying with great honors the last true Achaemenid Persian king, Darius III, and, for good measure, capturing and killing the pretender Bessus, who pretentiously called himself Artaxerxes V. Alexander was feeling pretty good about all these victories, and he began to see himself as something more than a Macedonian king. In fact, Alexander was really taking to some of the aspects of Persian culture, especially the semi-divine status of the ruler as a god king, draping himself in Persian garments and becoming aloof and disinterested in the people around him. The Macedonians were a rough and tumble people, used to plain talk and up-close and personal access to their king. Many of the inner circle rankled at Alexander's adoption of Persian manners and fashions, which they took as an affront to the hardy warrior ethic of the Macedonians. This was all a bit much for the general known as Cletus the Black. He, like Parmenio, was a rough-and-tumble commander that had been serving the Argeads back to the time of Philip II. Cletus was a brave soldier, and he had risen through the ranks to be one of the most senior and most gifted officers in the Macedonian army. You've actually encountered him before. Remember back when we discussed the Battle of Granicus? There was a Persian soldier about to stab his lance into the unsuspecting Alexander, and when, just at the last second, a comrade swooped in and severed the Persian's arm mid-swing. The fast-acting comrade that had saved Alexander's life at the outset of the conquest, this was Cletus. So not only was he not a slack-jawed yokel, he was a long-serving, loyal, and downright competent general, and Alexander owed his life to the older man's heroic intervention. In 338 BCE, Alexander threw a banquet to celebrate some of the promotions that he'd come up with and reassignments for his core troops. Cletus was miffed at this particular new assignment, thinking that his loyalty and service should have warranted greater honors than the ones that he felt he was getting from Alexander. Cletus was definitely not in a celebratory mood. But drinks were poured, and then more, and Alexander got good and drunk. He began bragging about his successes, claiming how superior he was and how much better his accomplishments were than those of his father Philip, and even mocking some of his own commanders who had died in battle. Cletus fumed, infuriated by the cocky younger man's arrogance. Alexander would have been nothing if it hadn't been for Philip's genius and innovation, and for the sacrifices of the brave men that had fought and died for the Macedonian cause. Cletus began yelling at Alexander. Alexander began yelling back. The argument devolved as the two men screamed at each other as the shocked partygoers looked on. Alex threw an apple at Cletus, and then he called for a dagger. Friends got between them and tried to calm everything down. Cletus was undeterred. More than 2 decades older than his king, Cletus had been fighting for Macedonia since before Alexander was born. He was not going to back down. Venting his frustrations, he kept pouring out the verbal onslaught as Alexander screamed back. Whipped up to a frenzy, an impulsive Alexander grabbed a spear and stabbed Cletus, killing his general on the spot. Those present were shocked and fell into a hushed silence. When he finally sobered up, Alexander was distraught. He had killed a man that had saved his life, a man that had served his father, a man of unimpeachable bravery and loyalty. He just spoke his mind, and Alexander had killed him for it. For days, Alexander was distressed, sunk into a deep, deep depression. The people around him thought that Alexander was suicidal. To help assuage the feelings of the king, some retainers invented a story that, Cletus had been plotting a coup all this time. The court philosopher, Anaxarchus, invented a rationalization of his own, stating that Alexander was the personification of justice, and because he was justice, he was incapable of being unjust. Alexander let himself be soothed. He allowed those around him to convince him that he was justified in the killing. What started out as genuine guilt and maybe a horrible act that would correct future behavior developed into righteous self-justification and victim blaming. It's hard to see any good in Alexander, both in this incident and in the way he let people around him reshape the narrative with him as a hero, as a defender of justice. Still, part of what made Cletus so upset in the first place was Alexander's increasing adoption of Persian customs and the manner in which Alexander conducted himself. It was one thing for a Macedonian to best a Persian in war. It was another thing entirely to begin to adopt the fashions and customs of your vanquished foes. The death of Cletus did not put an end to the grumbling over the adoption of Persian customs and the inclusion of Persian officials in the Macedonian administration. After all, why should these people who had been vanquished in battles enjoy positions of wealth and prestige? Shouldn't his countrymen enjoy all the spoils of war? Why would Alexander deny a lofty and lucrative administrative post to a Greek or Macedonian of proven loyalty and instead reward a Persian? But the disaffection went beyond the doling out of plum assignments. It also found roots in the way in which Alexander began carrying himself around his comrades. One practice that Alexander adopted was the custom of proskinesis, when a subordinate would supplicate themselves, groveling at and kissing the feet of the king. This practice, above all else, really rankled Alexander's corps of Macedonian commanders. Callisthenes, the court historian who had been following Alexander around and serving as an imperial hype man, was one of these disaffected fellows. Callisthenes was no mindless propagandist. A few years older than Alexander, Callisthenes was the nephew of Aristotle. Like Alexander, Callisthenes had likewise been tutored by the great philosopher. Uncle and nephew had collaborated on several projects, and Callisthenes had written a magisterial 10-volume history of Greece. Callisthenes detested Alexander's meddling of Persian and Greek cultures, especially proskinesis. Alexander found that Callisthenes spoke out against the custom at every turn. It started to get on his nerves. But when did disagreeing with the king become a crime? Technically, it wasn't, but in 327 BCE, a group of young pages were likewise upset by their humiliation at the feet of Alexander. A few of them started plotting. These pages were young, brash, and dumb, and word of their plot got out quickly. Callisthenes had nothing to do with the plot, but it presented Alexander with an opportunity to solve two problems at once, and he casually included Callisthenes in the roundup of the conspirators. Delighting in the opportunity to silence such a vocal critic, Alexander had Callisthenes imprisoned, tortured, and executed on the laughable pretense that he had been part of the half-baked plot schemed up by the bumbling young pages. Alexander might have seen himself as an enlightened melder of culture and custom, but the lifespans of anyone that opposed him were getting suspiciously short. Not everything that happened for Alexander in 327 BCE was so gloomy. As these purges were happening, Alexander was edging his army further east. One of the satraps that had conspired against Darius III was still fighting a guerrilla war in the region of Bactria. The satrap, not wanting his family to suffer the same fate as Darius's, sent them to an impregnable mountain fortress. Through some cunning and some brave rock climbing by a group of volunteers, the Macedonians took the fort and seized the satrap's family, an impressive accomplishment and one considered impossible by the fort's defenders. In light of his soldiers performing the impossible, Alexander decided to throw a celebration, as he so often did. During the festivities, he got one look at the Princess Roxanne, the daughter of the fugitive satrap, and fell deeply in love. Allegedly of unsurpassed beauty, it's not recorded how Roxanne felt about Alexander, but it's not like it mattered. Before moving on to the next conquest, and against the wishes of his companions, who preferred that Alex marry a Macedonian, he wed the Persian Roxanne. As Alexander subdued Bactria, he next set his sights on India. Given the rugged terrain, this should have been a difficult task, but thanks to the engineering acumen of his inner circle, generals, and companions, Perdiccas and Hephaestion, Alexander's army just kept marching. Crossing the Hindu Kush, Alexander's army expected to just keep rolling. In this campaign, which started at Macedonia and pushed east for more than 3,500 miles, Alexander and his forces had not once faced defeat. I've really just focused on Issus, Granicus, and Gaugamela as the major battles of this campaign, but there were countless engagements, hundreds of them, and Alexander and his forces had not known defeat in any meaningful way. What was to stop them from marching all the way across the earth and conquering every living soul? On the banks of the Hydaspes River in the Punjab territory of modern India, Alexander's army squared off against a local king named Porus. The subsequent battle was noteworthy for a few reasons. First, it was the most intense fight of Alexander's career. Casualties for Alexander's army were unusually high. Second, the fighting from King Porus deeply impressed Alexander. While his gang won the day and even captured the warrior king, Alexander was so impressed with Porus that he restored Porus to his rule and even granted him expanded territory. And third, finally, Alexander reached his furthest extent. His army was done. They were exhausted. They were far, far from home. They'd accomplished more than anyone could have imagined, toppled the Persian Empire, and grown obscenely rich in the process. What good was all this wealth if they were going to die thousands of miles from home? Time to head back, retire, reminisce on all their grand adventures, and luxuriate in all the trappings that such unsurpassed wealth and prestige could buy. There are stories about how, when faced with the prospect of turning home, Alexander wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer. Sorry, Hans Gruber, but this is unlikely. For there was plenty left to conquer. Alexander didn't think he'd reach the end of the world. He knew that, thanks to Porus, there were plenty of exotic, rich, and powerful kingdoms east across Asia. There were also territories much closer to home for him to subdue. Arabia, for example, beckoned. Besides, they had been fighting for a decade, and for some of the veterans who'd fought with Philip, much longer still. This was a group that deserved a break. Knowing that he wasn't foregoing all future glory by turning around, Alexander relented, and the lumbering Greco-Macedonian army turned around, resolved to march west for once and head for home. He and his army marched along the Indus River. Along the way, in a kind of farewell tour, they encountered and battled local tribes. Normally, such people would be easily brushed aside, but remember, Alexander always led from the front, and every enemy engagement had the chance to be life-threatening for the king, if not for his entire army. In one otherwise minor skirmish, Alexander's armor was penetrated by an arrow, which pierced his lung. In agony, the king was lucky to be surrounded by gifted physicians who removed the arrow, closed the wound, and saved his life. After he recovered, he continued his march south along the river. As they neared the Indian Ocean, he made a couple of curious decisions. The first was to split his army in two, with the larger force joining him on an overland march, while the second would board ships and sail under the command of Alexander's commander Nearchus. The second was to take the overland march directly through the desert, in theory a shorter distance, but unquestionably a more precarious one. At first, the march was uneventful, but as soldiers progressed deeper into the desert, things got hotter and drier. Food ran low, water was scarce, soldiers grew hungry, then starved and started dropping in their tracks, suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, exposure, starvation. Having conquered every army, every adversary that they faced, the entire fate of Alexander's army hung in the balance as they limped through the desert. At one point, his men managed to scrounge up some water in a helmet. They brought it to their weary king. Alexander accepted the helmet and then surveyed his men. Not wanting to enjoy the water as his men suffered, Alexander tipped the helmet out and dumped out the water. He was here to share their hardship. A noble gesture, for sure, but I'm sure it crossed the minds of his troops that they would have been better off just drinking it for themselves and not letting Alexander know about it. Eventually, after 60 grueling days, the Macedonian army made it out on the other side of the desert. Estimates vary on the losses, but reasonable estimates suggest that 12,000 men, 1/3 of his army, died in this march. It was a needless waste of life, but if anyone had the strength to complain, they sure kept quiet. Alexander had proven on more than one occasion that critique of the king was bad for everyone's life expectancy. For their part, the seafarers under the command of Nearchus suffered few casualties, but they had their own epic adventure, full of fraught seas, complex logistics, local entanglements, and shoddy navigation. It took them nearly 2 years to complete the oceanic voyage. Alexander couldn't have known it at the time, but his fighting days were over. He commanded the Macedonian forces in 20 major battles, often against vastly larger forces. He was 20-0. He also participated in numerous sieges and skirmishes. Every single time he lined up to fight or subdue, every single time, he won. Undefeated. Some battles were tough, others were routs, but all were victories. Like Philip, he'd suffered injuries, and in his last engagements in India, he'd almost lost his life in an otherwise meaningless contest. But he was still standing in the prime of his life and plotting his next campaign of glory. By 324 BCE, Alexander was back at Susa, the administrative capital of the now vanquished Achaemenid Persian Empire. He threw his considerable energy into his project of fusing the Persian and Greek worlds into one truly global empire and culture. In order to accomplish this goal, he understood that marrying the two cultures was vital. And I mean marrying, literally. Alexander gathered up the elite women of Persian society in the very top of his own officer corps and conducted a mass wedding. He paired them all off, fusing the top of each society together. For himself, Alexander added two more wives. Statira, the daughter of Darius III, it was her mother that died in childbirth at Alexander's camp a few years earlier, and Perisitis, the youngest daughter of one of Darius' predecessors, Artaxerxes III. He carefully made the matches. For Hephaestion, his closest friend and companion, Alex chose Drypetis, the youngest daughter of Darius III. This made them brothers-in-law. Alexander undertook this project so that the children that would result from these weddings would further cement the project of cultural fusion, and that all his kids would truly be the rightful heirs and successors of both the Argaeids and the Achaemenids. Two great houses would now be one. Hephaestion, for one, did not have long to enjoy his new bride. In 324 BCE, after what is now called the Weddings of Susa, Alexander moved his army to the city of Ecbatana. The officers cut loose, feasting, drinking, and letting go of all the stress and exhaustion of the last decade's relentless campaigning. To help entertain the men and contribute to their recuperation, Alexander brought in entertainments to perform and to amuse them. They partied hard. Following one of these legendary hard-drinking parties, Hephaestion grew ill. He took it easy for a week. He skipped all the food and booze. After some time, he felt better. As he recovered, Hephaestion ate some chicken, drank some wine, and in a couple hours, he was dead. No one knows how or why, but just like that, the number two man in the massive empire and Alexander's closest companion was gone. Alexander was hysterical, truly devastated. It's said that he curled up next to the corpse of his beloved friend and companion and had to be pulled away with great difficulty. Alexander made grand shows of mourning and ordered everyone else to do the same. He consciously evoked the mourning of Achilles over the death of Patroclus as portrayed in the Iliad. He cut his hair and wailed and moaned and lamented. For days, Alexander was inconsolable, genuine grief pouring out in unrelenting sobs. Aristotle had once described Alexander and Hephaestion as one soul with two bodies. For Alexander, the one person that he truly loved, trusted, felt comfortable with, was gone. For many people, Alexander's relationship with Hephaestion and his unrelenting grief at the death of his comrade has led to speculation that the two men were more than friends, that they were lovers. The ancient sources seem to make no mention of this, and the issue is cloudy at best. The prime evidence that people point to is the conscious attempts by the two to associate themselves with the pair Achilles and Patroclus from the Iliad. But this is far from definitive, because while many people have long assumed those two to have been lovers, Homer himself makes no indication within the text that this was the case. It's all quite speculative and ultimately unknowable. It also just doesn't matter. Alexander's grief was genuine. His boyhood companion, a man he loved, who'd been at his side all the way back to when they were receiving their education from Aristotle, the guy who, above all, had been his side through every single campaign, was gone. Alexander was bereft. Alexander ordered the body transmitted to Babylon, where an elaborate funeral was staged, capped by a funeral pyre 200 feet high. Out of respect to their fallen comrade and to make sure Alexander saw that they shared in his grief, his commanders consigned their own personal armor to the flames of the pyre. Devastated though he may have been, Alexander turned his thoughts to what came next. By 323 BCE, Alexander was in Babylon. He had plans for the future. Roxanne was pregnant with his, hopefully, son and successor, and he set his sights on his next conquest. The next target for his expansionist agenda was the Arabian Peninsula. It required considerable planning and would involve coordinating land and sea movements. In late May, Alexander went to another one of those epic drinking parties. As he stumbled back to his quarters, another friend begged him to come to another party. He went and he drank some more, and at one point he screamed out in pain, saying that he felt a stabbing pain in his back. And yet, the following day, he continued his drinking and feasting. His next few days were spent trying to uphold his duties as king, spending time in leisure and planning his upcoming Arabian campaign. But each day he was a bit worse than the day before, and fever took hold and did not relent. Soon he had to be carried everywhere, but the stubborn king insisted on performing ritual sacrifices, planning his campaigns, and administering his empire. But each day he could do a little less. He was eventually confined to his sickbed, and it became apparent to all that he was unlikely to recover. As the fever took its final hold on Alexander, he slipped into and out of consciousness. In one fit of semi-lucidity, he was asked, "To whom should the empire go?" His response, "To the strongest." After an illness of about 2 weeks, Alexander III, king of the massive Macedonian Empire, died in Babylon in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar the Great. He was just shy of his 33rd birthday, and he'd ruled for a dozen eventful, violent, and transformative years. Describing the events that happened after the death of Alexander would take at least as long as the several parts of this episode. There was civil war, murders, imprisonments, betrayal, and just all sorts of awful things. Here's a few highlights. Almost immediately, Roxanne murdered Alexander's 2 other wives. His generals fell out and started a bloody conquest for control of the empire. His mother started feuding with one of the commanders that had been running the empire in Alexander's absence. One companion even stole Alexander's corpse and absconded with it to Egypt. The empire won by so much conquest shattered with Alexander's death, eventually cleaving off into half a dozen subsidiary empires, some of which lasted for centuries. His generals, well, the ones that survived the civil war, founded dynasties that gave us things like Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, and the Antigonid and Antipatrid dynasties. The aftermath of Alexander's death reverberated for hundreds of years. Alexander probably would have liked it that way. He went out on top, and no one could build on his accomplishments. For a guy singularly driven by a burning ambition to be seen on par with not only his mortal men, but also with the gods, it's easy to imagine his satisfaction at the idea that it all fell apart without him. Alexander had built on the legacy of Philip, pushing the empire further than anyone thought possible. But there would be no one to follow Alexander. He wanted to be the greatest of the greats. Perhaps his enigmatic "to the strongest" was an attempt to goad his generals into civil war, so that they would tear the whole thing to pieces. If so, it worked. The death of Alexander is shrouded in mystery. How did he die? Natural causes? If so, what was it? Typhoid fever? Malaria? West Nile? Or was he the victim of his own excesses, suffering from alcohol poisoning? People have been speculating about his cause of death for millennia. To this day, academics publish white papers and research articles proposing to definitively identify this cause or that cause, as though it's possible to reconstruct the cause of death from the scant clues about his symptoms. It's interesting, but ultimately, it's unknowable. Or was it, perhaps, something more sinister? If he had been assassinated, who was responsible? It's likely not a surprise, but there are a lot of theories and suspects. Some implicate Aristotle, who conspired to have Alexander poisoned as revenge for Alex's killing of Aristotle's nephew Callisthenes. Others point the finger at Antipater, the regent Alexander had left in control of Macedonia, as it appears that he fell out with the king and was facing recall. Some think that Aristotle and Antipater were co-conspirators. Antipater's involvement is slightly plausible, as Antipater's son Cassander popped up in Babylon just before Alexander got sick, then quietly headed home after the king died. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but eventually, Cassander will imprison, then kill Roxanne and her young son, born after Alexander died, so that he, Cassander, could take over Macedonia. Cassander was undoubtedly cruel, a historical villain if there ever was one. Others hint that the responsible party has not been identified, but given Alexander's killing of people like Parmenio, Callisthenes, Cletus, and others, that someone calculated that they needed to get to Alexander before Alexander got to them. Even the ancient historians, always prone towards excitability, tend to dismiss the poison theories. None of the symptoms from which Alexander suffered matched the poisons used in the ancient world. The consensus, both ancient and modern, seems to be that Alexander died of an unidentifiable illness, contracted in Babylon and exacerbated by his constant, relentless work, hard play, hard behavior. No matter what, Alexander the Great was dead. So what should we make of this guy? Let's start with his empire. It's often said that Alexander built the largest empire the world had ever seen. The logic went that he took his Macedonian empire and fused it with the sprawling Persian one, and together these added up to a truly massive territory. He did do this, but such logic overlooks something important. In the Darius the Great episode, we covered the fact that under the ruling of this great king, the Achaemenid Persian Empire reached its greatest extent. Implied in this statement is that after Darius, the empire receded. Given the tumult that followed the assassination of Xerxes, little pieces of the empire calved off here and there. By the time Alexander came around, the Persian Empire was notably smaller than it had been a couple centuries earlier. The land lost to Persia before Alexander was greater than the land added by him in the conquest. Even adding the Macedonian Empire to the Persians, Darius the Great's Persian Empire had about 100,000 square miles on Alexander's combined Persian and Macedonian one. Now, this is all under the assumption that size matters. Both empires were huge, but if Alexander is considered so great because he was the biggest, well, it wasn't. Not for his time, not for all time. The most significant accomplishment of Alexander's conquest was his toppling of the Persian Empire. This was no small feat. Far from a teetering and unstable polity, the Persian Empire was fully functioning and reasonably stable at the time of Alexander's conquest. Its satraps were administering their territory, taxes and commerce flowed, the infrastructure was maintained, arts and architecture thrived. As evidenced by the massive treasury seized by Alexander at places like Susa and Persepolis, it was extremely wealthy and prosperous. Most importantly for this story, Darius III had considerable resources from which to draw to organize armies and offer battle. The Persian Empire was not some rotten old edifice that came crashing down with a gentle shove. Well, this means that, militarily, Alexander's campaigns were difficult and the results were certainly impressive. Administratively, once he had those battlefield successes, all he needed to do was put his own people in place with a well-functioning and pre-existing administration. It's not like he had to spend too much time on governance, maintenance, bureaucracy, reform, organization, etc. His empire, if we can call it that, was mostly just crossing off Darius' name at the head of the org chart and penciling in his own. The Persians tended to see Alexander less as a conqueror and more of a usurper. Then again, the Persian Empire wouldn't have existed in the first place without the likes of Cyrus II and Darius I having conquered other people and integrated them into their holdings. In many ways, Alexander was the beneficiary of his Persian predecessors, but he also more or less followed the same script that they had written in the first place. When weighing up the accomplishments of Alexander, many scholars are quick to suggest that the benefit of his conquest is that it spread Hellenic culture far and wide. It's tough to argue that those Greeks didn't have some ideas worth spreading. The physical infrastructure built by Persia and the extensive linking of the east-west axis of the Eurasian landmass greatly aided the spreading of ideas and culture from one side of the world to the other. When weighing up the contributions of Alexander, it cannot be overstated that this exchange of thinking, this spread of Hellenic culture, ranks by historians as among his most important legacies. The exchange of cultural ideas and artifacts definitely was an outcome of Alexander's conquest, but implicit in this idea of spreading Hellenic culture is also the idea that somehow Greek culture was superior to the ones of the people to whom it was spread. In this logic, Greek ideas were superior to Persian ones, so Alexander made the world a better place by tossing aside Persian culture and overwriting it with his own. I find this a bit dubious, personally, and besides, it's not like this was the goal of Alexander's conquests. Even if we say that his conquest had the positive benefit of Hellenizing the world, then should we give credit to Alexander for it? He was simply trying to conquer, to be the greatest commander of all time. The cultural exchange was an outcome, a byproduct, not his stated goal. Similarly, Alexander is often given credit for founding Alexandria, which would, in short, go on to be one of the most important centers of culture, science, mathematics, and learning that the world has ever known. So much of what we know today can find its intellectual roots in Alexandria. But Alexander founded and named dozens of cities after himself, 70 in fact. He even named one after his warhorse Bucephalus. With Alexandria, he picked a great spot for sure, but credit for developing the city goes to Ptolemy, who founded the dynasty that made Alexandria its capital, one that ruled Egypt for 300 years, which was actually the longest dynasty in Egypt's history, and it culminated in, yes, that Cleopatra. It's not what Alexander did wasn't impressive. It's just that weighing up his life and career, the things for which he tends to get the most credit are a combination of pro-Greek ethnocentrism, unintended byproducts of accomplishing other goals, or developments that happened long after he was dead. He had no vision for a great Hellenic empire to diffuse the very best ideas and knowledge around the world. His vision was for his own glory, and in this he was an unqualified success. Conqueror, usurper, call him what you will. In terms of militarism, the results were and are unsurpassed. He had one goal, to be the greatest conqueror of all time, and he exceeded. Well, to many, I still give the tip of the cap to Cyrus. If you haven't, go back and listen to his episode. Then compare these two and judge for yourself. All the other grand accomplishments of Alexander can be framed as accidents or byproducts. Still, he was undefeated and was never bested. If he'd lived longer, maybe someone would have finally have gotten the upper hand, but he didn't live longer. It's also possible that he would have conquered the Arabian Peninsula in his next planned campaign. No matter what would have happened, he went out on top. And this is why the Romans first called him the Great. The name has stuck ever since. Now, I just said if he had lived longer. No one invites more speculation than Alexander. Speculative history can be a lot of fun. What if this happened? What if that happened? Such questions always spark a lot of debate. Ultimately, though, they are always just that, conjecture. We argue enough about things that did happen. How on earth can we have an informed debate about things that might have happened? Still, this doesn't stop people from asking and arguing about the past that could have been. No question in speculative history is asked more than some iteration of, how would things have been different if Alexander had lived longer? We can't know, but I have a few thoughts. Alexander learned from the Persians. He welcomed vanquished foes at court, paid respects to local custom, religion, and ritual, and worked to integrate disparate cultures into a unified polity. He was not blindingly ethnocentric. Aristotle taught Alexander to be curious about the world, to understand that other people and other cultures have intrinsic value equal to the Greeks. For all his self-aggrandizing bravado, Alexander had a fundamental respect for the other in a way that is highly uncommon for his age or any age. Alexander's Hellenic inner circle did not care for this, not one bit. They saw access to the king as a zero-sum issue, and the more Persians nosed their way into the inner circle, the less access to Alexander that they had. Alexander showed a firm conviction in his own leadership. He didn't tolerate dissension. The longer he'd had to pursue his project, the more successful he would have been at integrating the cultures. At least, he would have been more so than he was able to accomplish in his short time on Earth. The blending of the two great cultures from that corner of the world, Greek and Persian, would have been spectacular. Of course, this project died with him. For example, with only one exception, all the other officers divorced their Persian wives from their Susa weddings. Or maybe Alexander's increasingly short fuse would have undone everything. He had come of age appreciating the great intellectual spirit of Aristotle, loving knowledge and wisdom for its own sake and respecting ideas, debate, and discussion. He was unquestionably bright, a gifted intellect to go with his driving ambition. Charismatic and charming, Alexander won people to his way of seeing things and inspired his men to do great things, often against long odds. He was curious, and he shared what he found in his adventures, sending letters back with words of the wonders he encountered. But there were two sides to his personality. When he was at ease, he could be open-minded, calm, and thoughtful. When his temper flared, he became violent, angry, and impulsive. It was in this agitated state that he had killed one of his most loyal commanders with his own hands, a man that had saved his own life. Toward the end of his life, this side of his personality seemed to win out more often. His tolerance for dissent was almost non-existent. He grew increasingly self-absorbed and rationalized the elimination of people that had done nothing but serve him loyally and ably. Maybe it was for the best that he died when he did. Ultimately, for as much has been said about Alexander, there is something deeply elusive about him. What he was like, what made him tick, why he did things. One thing is for sure, though. The later generations, who valued conquest so highly, came to see him as the greatest of all time. I guess it's up to you to decide if they were right. Okay, I did it. I climbed my Mount Everest. I do hope you enjoyed the climb. Like Jake with Brooks Hadlin, it was sure nice to have the company. Now we can finally move on from Alexander the Great. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we go spend some time in another part of the world, one we've barely discussed so far. We're headed to India to meet Asoka the Great.